Mhm. Good afternoon, everybody who's coming in. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes and then we're going to get started. Um, and if you are here for the Jane Austen's Sanditon from unfinished swan song to British costume drama, you are in the right place. My name is Jill Kenny from the Chelmsford Public Library here in Massachusetts. And oftentimes we have people that zoom in from other places. So I just wanted to say where we're from. But I wanted to welcome Claire Evans. Claire Evans is an author, former journalist, attorney, and college lecturer who started her love of most things British as she and her mother watched countless Britcoms on PBS. She studied abroad in London, and against the odds, she married a Brit. She met in, oh, I'm going to say this wrong, Peoria, Illinois.
Perfect.
They lived in England for a number of years. Her business, Tea with Claire, grew from friends asking for travel advice. Her memoir, High Tea and the Lowdown, is the true story of what it's really like to marry a witty Englishman, move to Britain, and make every cultural faux pas imaginable. Can't wait to hear about that.
That's a
Well,
different
welcome, Claire. I will turn the tables over to you.
Thank you. Well, you've heard me open my mouth, so you know I'm not a Brit, so I'll reveal not quite all. I live in Peoria, Illinois. Very well done, Jill. Thank you. That is, if you cared to know, it's probably 2 hours and 45 minutes to the southwest of Chicago, but we're really not at all part of Chicago. It's a fairly big-ish city, 110 some thousand. Why am I here? Well, I've lived in a lot of vocations and had multiple vocations. I met my husband here. This has been 20 years ago, and he was on temporary assignment with his company. He's born in a town, city, I should say, Coventry, pretty much smack in the center of England. So after we met and we dated and we got married here, and then within 6 months, his company wanted him back. So off we went. And I've lived in the UK about 4 years in various stints. So we tend to go back about once a year. I do a bunch of different talks. I've kind of evolved into a UK specialist. So for years, people have been asking, do you do anything on Jane Austen? And I can't say that I have. I kind of take a lot of cues from PBS, and I always talk about things that I like. So I do like Jane Austen, but I was a bit, I thought, well, that's well-trod ground, we'll put it that way. There's a ton of academics, there's lots written, books have come out every year on her, it seems like. So do I have anything to add? But I do talk a lot about British television. This is part of my background. And Sanditon was made into a British costume drama for ITV. It was a miniseries for 3 seasons. Now I have material. So, just in time for Jane's 250th birthday, which, by the way, it will be a week from yesterday. It's ticking down the timer. I went on a summer holiday, as we usually do, to England and put a few research components in it. So you'll see some of my vacation pictures as we go along. So the name of the show is Sanditon, and it does come from an unfinished manuscript. In fact, Jane Austen's last. She was due to, I'm afraid, be ill and not survive much longer after she started this manuscript. I had a very, very intrepid librarian a few nights ago immediately say, I recognize the background. And it's written on the slide in case you don't know it. And I think that's obscure that she knew. This is Jane Austen's wallpaper. And the librarian hadn't actually been to the property where this wallpaper is, but I'll clue you in. So I just thought it was a nice background. When you visit the museum called Jane Austen's house, it's in a little village called Chawton, and we'll get to that much in fairly good detail in a few minutes. They've recreated 2 rooms with the original wallpaper that Jane Austen would have seen in her lifetime when she lived in this house, based on little scraps that they found. And in the UK, they are very good at replicating things historically and with accuracy. So they were able to raise money to have a firm remanufacture these patterns, and it's back to the way it would have been. This would have been the early part of the 1800s. So as Jane goes, authors that is, There's not a lot to go on. There's a very nice, a very fine book, a biography of Jane Austen. It's simply called Jane Austen, A Life. And it's by another Claire. Her name's Claire Tomalin, rather prolific nonfiction writer. She described it in a beautiful way. I think that when it comes to trying to study Jane Austen, I'm paraphrasing, it's like trying to look at the clouds in a night sky. And I think what she meant by that is that for someone of her, shall we say, fame nowadays and esteem that she's held in literary circles, there's really not a whole lot about her life to go on. And we'll see why as the talk goes on. So it begins with this picture. This is the only known picture of Jane Austen done of her face in her lifetime, and it was done by her older sister Cassandra. There is another picture of her done in her lifetime, but she's got her back to Cassandra. And Cassandra draws her overlooking something with only a rear nod of face forward, so not much use to know what she looked like on that basis. Well, you can see her dates, December 16, 1775 to July 18, 1817. So if you're quick with your math, you'll find she died quite young. She was only 41. And for someone of her era, she lived in a lot of places. There's but a partial listing of the various towns she was associated with. So her background is that she was the daughter of a rector from a family of fairly wealthy wool merchants. However, her immediate family, the Austens, her mother, father, and all of her siblings, they were not particularly wealthy themselves. They aspired to be something the historians call the pseudo gentry, and that just means that they would like to be in the landed gentry and own land, but they do not. So they were related to people with money, but particularly them, no, not really. There were inheritances flowing around them, not to them, but with one big exception, and that is Jane had an older brother that is adopted by a pair of wealthy relatives and inherits their property and money, and that'll come up in a few minutes too. So they had some nice things, but they were frugal and they moved fairly frequently due to finances, but particularly after the death of Jane's father. So Jane and her older sister Cassandra were quite unusual in their time. They were unmarried. That would have been really against the grain, and it came down to Jane, Cassandra, and their mother, also named Cassandra, and you would use the term spinster, family friend named Martha. They were grouped together and they lived together and they basically were shuttled around, particularly after Jane's father died, to other male relatives who would either pay their way from accommodation or find somewhere for them to live and pay their rent. So this is a slide meant to clarify some of the names that the Brits give their historical periods. So their habit is to name periods of history after whoever was on the throne at the time. So the Georgian era, after the kings, plural, George, there were four, is big, actually. It is Jane's era, but it began in 1714. Jane's born in 1775. At the time of her birth, George III is the monarch. And by the way, he was the one that was in charge during the American Revolution, too. So you may know that in his lifetime, he suffers from mental illness. And upon him not being able to manage the affairs of his monarchy anymore, they appoint his eldest son, Prince Regent. And that is where the term regency comes in. So the Prince Regent was in charge from 1811 to 1820. But then George III, his father, dies. And now the Prince Regent will be fully King George IV. However, here's a bit of an addendum. Historians tend to lump William IV into this Georgian era. And the reason is that technically he's not a George, but under his reign, the manners and culture of the people were much more Georgian in their tendencies than they would be with whom followed, and that was Queen Victoria. So during her time, it's going to get very upright and very buttoned down and very proper, the Victorians. Not so much the Georgians. They're a bit bawdy. They enjoy a good time. So the reign of William IV tends to be more that way. So back in the world of Jane, a bit of a timeline for you. She's born in Steventon Parsonage. That is the house. If you were a fan and you wanted to go visit it, I'm afraid you would be disappointed because they tore it down some time ago. It was built on low-lying land and it was prone to flooding. And so this was her father's part of his assignment as a parson. He was given a parsonage. So, various points, Jane and her sister Cassandra are sent off to boarding school, and they go to Oxford and Southampton and Reading. And she starts writing about age 11. So, during her teenage years, she produces a body of work that is referred to by the scholars as her juvenilia. And it's not got, finished novels in it per se. And she's a kid. She's kind of just getting started. But she's still already quite hard at work. So by 1795, she is just 20. She's written a book called Eleanor and Marianne. Now, if those names ring a bell, you would be right to think that that will turn into Sense and Sensibility. This is a common theme that the title, her working titles of her books, will ultimately get published under a different name. So hopefully it's not too confusing. And she carries on. She's in between the years of 1796 and 7, she writes a book she calls First Impressions, which will become Pride and Prejudice. And then she writes a book, Susan, which will become Northanger Abbey. You sense a trend here. But she is thrown a major loop in her life when she's 26 years old. And that is because her parents decide that they're moving their family to Bath. This is a very controversial move for Jane. She doesn't want to go. She's very happy where she was in Steventon. So they last a while in Bath, but her father ultimately passes away there in 1805, and then it becomes a bit chaotic. Her mother and sister and friend, and she moved to Southampton. But you may ask, if you've read her works, you know she's bright and witty and she'd be attractive. Well, what's going on? Why would they want to necessarily move her away? It's because she and Cassandra are what the Georgians called on the shelf. That means they're aging, unmarried young women. And by their standards, 26 wasn't necessarily very young. So by moving to Bath, her parents thought that they would radically improve the girls' prospects of finding husbands. Well, we know for fact that she was proposed to once. There may have been other times, but this is a slam dunk because it's in writing. Why is she on the shelf? Well, the proposal came from a young man named Harris Bigwither. That is his name. The story goes that in the autumn of 1802, Jane and her sister Cassandra were visiting a couple of sisters that were friends of theirs from childhood, and they'd gone to this large estate that their family owned, and there was their younger brother by quite a few years. He was 21, Jane is 27, and he had just finished his university training. So he blurts out a proposal to Jane. And there's immense society pressure to accept. So she does. Her first inkling is she must take it. She goes to bed. She attempts to sleep. This doesn't go well. In the morning, she recants. She turns him down. They were supposed to stay for weeks, but now things are awkward. So she and Cassandra Vamouche, they have to get out of there. It would not have been a good match. So he rarely spoke, which was quite different from the way Jane was described as ebullient and quite sociable. She liked balls, she liked dancing. So she had also a flirtation, by the way, with a young man named Tom Lefroy. This is less well documented, but they say his history books still include it as reliable information. So they were young and they were both without resources. He was a law student, and of course, she doesn't have any family money to speak of. And he was staying with relatives nearby to her house in Steventon, and they realized, the relatives, that something was going on maybe between them. So Tom Lefroy's relatives send him away. And that's pretty much the end of that. So he did go on to marry quite well. By well, I mean wealthy. Maybe no, perhaps not happily. I don't know about that, but he became the Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. So back on Harris Bigwither, It's a good thing to say that Jane followed her own advice. She had a niece named Fanny that she was particularly close to, and they would correspond frequently. And Fanny asked for love advice once, and Jane's reply was, anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. So she's no hypocrite, at least. Just as a FYI, though, Harris had a poor reputation. He once served party guests a really revolting mix of a bunch of old wines that he just had on hand and threw together and called it punch. And they grouse about this. So he makes an announcement, and he's said to have said, gentlemen, my punch is like you. In your individual capacity, you are all very good fellows, but in your corporate capacity, you are very disagreeable. So Jane's pressure to accept, though, would have been immense. There was a book of her time called Essays on an Old Maid. And the author, named William Haley, was writing about what will happen to the unmarried daughter of a gentleman. He said, it is probable that after having passed the sprightly years of youth in the comfortable mansion of an opulent father, she is reduced to the shelter of some contracted lodging in a country town, attended by a single servant. Well, her father, Jane's father, was not that wealthy to be described that way, but what happened is really not that far off. So Jane knew, though, another factor in her head would have been she had just sold her first novel, and she'd earned £10 for the book Susan. That's going to become Northanger Abbey much, much later. And so she's a paid writer, and she knows that likely she's expected to be wife and mother. She won't have the time to do this anymore. And perhaps being a mother in these ages wasn't particularly appealing. So the statistics went that two of her own sisters-in-law had died in childbirth. And between the years 1750 to 1799, women had an average of 7 live births. 7. And they tended to stagger them every 18 months or so. So this would have been what would happen to Jane had she taken him up on the offer. So some of the layout, shall we say, UK layout that's pertinent, I can give you a little bit of a orientation. If you've ever been to England, then you may know roughly London is headed toward the east. The circle around it is a good orienting landmark. That's the major motorway, the M25, the ring road that goes around the city. So a lot of these places aren't really far from each other. So there is Steventon, where she's born, and the Arrows, Oxford, and Reading are places where she went to school growing up. The farthest flung that her family visited and talks about is Lyme Regis. Lyme Regis was a Georgian seaside resort in Dorset, the county is Dorset, down on the south coast. They love the sea. When she was forced to move at age 26, it's to Bath. Here is Bath. So just as a how far apart are these places? The place where she spent most productive time is Chawton coming up. And that is about 34 miles outside of London. And then here is Winchester, which will be actually where she passes away. That's only 14 miles away. So she would have had fairly good access to see her family, even if they stayed in similar places to where she was born. She didn't live terribly far. So in 1809, she and her sister mother and the family friend moved to Chawton. At this point, Jane is 34 years old. So the house that you see is the Jane Austen House Museum. This is Chawton Cottage. Her brother Edward Austen Knight owned the building. He lived just down the road in a mansion, in a manor house. He had inherited this from the distant wealthy relatives who adopted him when he was a young boy. So as part of the deal, they had no male relatives to pass any of their wealth or their land on to. And in the rules of English aristocracy, only men can inherit. So they went so far as to adopt him, and his name became Austen Knight. So there are people alive that have that last name, Knight, and they are related to Jane Austen because they come from this branch of the family. So he's very well off nowadays. He's the only one. And he's got this cottage that's idle. It used to be the bailiff's cottage, and the bailiff was the person who kind of kept law and order on the estate. So he really begrudgingly allowed them to live there rent free because somebody had to take care of them amongst the men that earned money. So before the Austen women got there, it was a pub. And in fact, by their moving in date, 1809, it had already been there for 300 years. So this is not necessarily a new property, but have a look at the timeline. This place is quite revered because it would prove to be the place where she spent the most creatively prolific period of her life. So she's moved in 1809. 1811, she revises and publishes Sense and Sensibility. Within 2 years, there's Pride and Prejudice. The next year after that, 1814, is Mansfield Park, and she keeps going. 1815 has got Emma in it. She writes between 15 and 16 a book called The Elliotts, and that'll get published under a different name, Persuasion. So in 1817, January, she begins a manuscript she's calling The Brothers. Later, her family will start to refer to it as Sanditon, but she does not finish. She becomes ill, and ultimately in May of that year, she moves to Winchester from Chawton to be closer to medical treatment, and she passes away there. She really only lives there 6 weeks. So she's buried in Winchester Cathedral, and after her death, there's only six published novels of hers in existence in their entirety, and two of them came out in after she had died. They were Northanger Abbey, the original Susan, the one that she sold first, believe it or not, and Persuasion. They came out in December of the year she passed away, 1817. So none of her books ever in her lifetime had her name on them. She was never given credit as author while she was living, which to our ears as modern people is rather unbelievable. But actually, this is not terribly uncommon. So whether she believed this or not, I don't know, but it was thought that by including her name as a professional writer on these books, it would hurt her marriage prospects and perhaps her appearance of gentility, that she worked for a living and that she earned money for writing. There was a fair amount of prejudice against novelists. Being a novelist is kind of a unique art form. It hadn't been around very long. The first English novel published was Robinson Crusoe, and it had come out in 1719. So it had a lot of time to establish itself. Just as an FYI, we're going to go to Chawton and talk about that now. And here it is. There's London, 34 miles to the southwest is Chawton. And here's what it looks like. And this would have been very similar to what it looked like when Jane lived there too. So this road here is a major thoroughfare, not a super highway, certainly, but in Jane's time, it was a major coaching road. The stagecoaches that ran up to London and then over to Winchester, they rumbled past here several times a day. And if you see right here is a bricked up window. Well, that was done in the tenure of the Austens. So the family had an interesting little habit. They would write to each other in cute verse. And she wrote to her brother Frank about their new arrival at this house. She says, "Our Chawton home, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete it will all other houses beat that ever have been made or mended, with rooms concise or rooms distended." So she's referring to home improvements. They requested successfully that their brother pay to have this window bricked up and a new window put in here. And that was so that she could overlook the garden instead of people spying in their windows from the passing coaches as they rumbled past, for a bit of privacy. So this is a great museum to visit. So we're into the era of Claire's vacation holiday pictures, and here come more. It's me in a bonnet, and there I am. I don't know that it's very fetching, but I will say this is the bakehouse just outside the home, where they also did laundry. The museum has put a rack of Georgian clothing in, so you can try on bonnets. And my husband there tried on the top hat and the waistcoat. And my daughter is apparently, or she's calling somebody an obstinate, headstrong girl. They had little, what would you call them, dialogue bubbles that they could pose with. That's the quote that Lady Catherine de Bourgh says to Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. So inside the house, You can get a little glimpse of what it would have been like to be Jane there. There's that other pattern of wallpaper that has been recreated to be what she saw in her lifetime. So Chawton as a venue, her home there is kind of a step down in quality compared to the other places she had lived, but we really can't knock it. And she certainly didn't because she wrote and revised all six of her novels there. So creatively, it's very fruitful. Her mother and her sister are on board with what she's doing. You can see this is her writing desk. She had two. She had one that she would carry around if they were traveling, like a with a flip top that was highly portable. And this one, she used to use it to move from windows with good light so she could write, but she liked to write in the dining room. So they agreed that for the rest of the house, Jane's only duties in housekeeping would be looking after the supplies of tea and coffee and wine and sugar. And every morning she would be in charge of toasting bread for breakfast. And that is all. So the rest of her time she could focus on her writing, except that family had 33 nieces and nephews, so frequently they found themselves entertaining guests. In fact, it's said that she liked to write in the dining room, according to family lore, because not only did it have the best light, but the dining room door was squeaky. And Jane used to write in her fiction in little packets. She would make tiny booklets out of paper so that she could kind of squirrel them away, and the squeaky door was a warning. She knew she was about ready to be interrupted. So, she, though, as a writer goes aside from her fiction, is prolific as a letter writer, a correspondent. The estimates are that she wrote more than 3,000 letters in her lifetime. However, only 160 of them survive. This is the source of the quote where it's trying to study a cloud in a night sky, because Cassandra, her older sister, was the executrix of Jane's will upon her death, and shortly before Cassandra passed away, she burned most of what she had in correspondence from Jane. There are a few people that got letters too that they might have held on to, other people in the family, and people nowadays would say, why, especially Jane scholars that would have liked to have read and for insight into her life. Well, Jane, as you know, is fairly brutally honest, very forthright. She's a keen observer of people, and from what survives, she describes her family members sometimes in the same ways. So she pulls no punches in what's happening around her, and she even recycled some of the scenarios that were coming out of her own family into plot lines and setups in her fiction. So this was likely done to avoid posthumous embarrassment, that Cassandra thought that she was doing Jane a favor. And perhaps Cassandra wanted to protect herself too, but frankly, it wasn't unusual for people who had died, if they had surviving correspondence, it would be burned upon their death. So the Chawton Cottage has a really nice little gift shop, and I got this little wallet there, and I gave more of an eyeball to it than when I first bought it, and I knew there's 6 novels, and this has 7. So what's going on? If I screw in my monocle, I can see that they've included Sanditon, that little green book on its side. So, what about Sanditon? It is unfinished. Many have attempted to finish it over the years, some more successful than others. So, the heir apparent to finish Sanditon was thought to be Jane's niece Anna. So, she was very close to her Aunt Jane, and she was a writer too. She aspired to be. Jane gave her plenty of writing advice, but people who study Jane Austen's writing they realize that she's got almost an intuitive sense of story and dialogue and wit, and that is a gift that not everyone can just have. So Anna never really was up to the task. She did not finish the book, and it had certainly never been adapted for TV or film before the recent TV series. So Jane begins The Brothers. It's later called Sanditon by her family in January of 1817. She quits working on it in March. The very last entry is dated in March. She cannot. She's just physically not up to it anymore. She was thinking things are going downhill. She writes out her will in April. She doesn't have much, and Cassandra's going to manage it all. And then she and Cassandra moved to the nearby town Winchester, 14 miles to the southwest, in May. And it's here that they stayed because it was quite convenient to, there's a hospital nearby, and Jane's doctor is there too. This is right around the corner from Winchester Cathedral, and some friends of their family owned it at the time. Now it's owned by Winchester College. That is a very elite school for young people. And in fact, this past summer, because this cottage still exists on College Street, it was open to the public, which usually it is not, in honor of her 250th anniversary. Granted, she only lived there 6 weeks, and she did die there. Leave it to the Brits, though. They never miss an opportunity to stick a blue plaque on a building of anything of note historically. This is the house where Jane Austen stayed and died. So you could not get into this tour. We were there when it was going on for love or money. It was very quickly sold out. And frankly, it wasn't high on my list of things to see because the Jane Austen House Museum is so much better and it encompasses a whole lot more time of her life. So people will ask, naturally, and it's addressed at the museum too, why did she die? Well, the fact is that no one will know exactly why. So back in the 70s, a medical professional took a stab at figuring it out based on what little there was left in letters describing what was happening with her at the time, her symptoms. And he came up with a theory that she suffered from Addison's disease, which in our time is treatable. And it's pretty simple. In fact, usually it's treated with a bit of steroids and you can go on with your life. There's also been theories that she would have had Hodgkin's lymphoma. That's probably not near as survivable, and that's true now too. Also, another theory, she had tuberculosis. So, in that time, contaminated meat and milk, particularly among cows, is a real threat. The England would not go on to pasteurize its milk until the 1920s. So if you were a young person in your youth, you either ate meat that was contaminated or drank milk that was, that disease can take a while to kill you. There's even a theory that she was poisoned. Now, not natural or not on purpose, but arsenic poisoning from medicines. The preparations of prescriptions would have been containing arsenic, and apparently they found a shock of her hair and had it tested, and it was positive for that. Point being, not these are all speculative, so no one will know for sure ever. What we do know, because it's very much described in her sister's letters, is that she lost consciousness and she died in the wee hours of July 18th, 1817, and Cassandra was holding her head in bed when she passed away. They were very, very close. So her funeral was held just 6 days later, and it had to happen before the 10 a.m. service at Winchester Cathedral. Her brother Henry, by this time, was studying to be part of the clergy, and he knew someone at Winchester Cathedral. And Jane liked that venue too, admired it for its beauty, so they thought she wouldn't object to being there. So at the time, though, Cassandra did not attend her funeral, and that wasn't for want of going of wanting to be there. Women weren't allowed to attend funerals. It was thought that the female constitution was too weak to get through a funeral service. So Jane was only attended by three of her brothers and a nephew and the vicar, and then they had to be out of there in time for 10 o'clock. So Cassandra returned to Chawton, and that's where she lived out the rest of her life. On her tombstone, which you can see at Winchester, her brother Henry was the one in charge of placing it and the writing that's on it. By this time, he's studying to be in the clergy. So, and she's also the daughter of a vicar. So you would expect there's a lot of references to her heart, her temper. It does say the extraordinary endowments of her mind. That's the only hint that exists on her tombstone of what she did for a living. And she didn't support herself, to be fair. In her lifetime, she only earned £650 from her writing. She was getting famous. She was maybe well known is a better word by the time that she was really on a roll in her later books. But by comparison, £650 is what a Georgian solicitor would earn in about 6 months. So she certainly had to rely on the benevolence of her family to be supported. But he did not take it upon himself to write anything on her tombstone about her writing. However, later that year, he is asked to provide a biographical note in the two books that are hers that will come out after her death, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. And that is the first time that her name is ever attached to her work. And that was down to him. So we can't fault him entirely. That is the rest of the tombstone. Lots of florid detail about heaven, devotion, faith, nothing so much about writing. So, understandably, Cassandra is incredibly upset. Her more mild account of how things went to a niece, Fanny Knight. You can see her picture there as an older lady that's up at the Jane Austen Museum. So Cassandra wrote to their niece, "Never was human being more sincerely mourned by those who attended her remains than was this dear creature. May the sorrow with which she is parted from on earth be a prognostic of the joy with which she is hailed in heaven." Although she has a more fine point on it when she corresponds later about how she personally feels upon her loss. And I think this is one of the most lovely things you could say about a lost relative. "I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as has never can have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I lost a part of myself." So Cassandra passes away in 1845. So Jane's literary reputation after her death is kind of in a hover pattern. People amongst the higher class know of her work. The Prince Regent is a fan of her work. That was not something that she particularly clung to. She hated the Prince Regent. He really lived a fairly dishonorable lifestyle, if you asked her, and it was true, even by Georgian standards. And she was a bit, shall we say, pressed into dedicating one of her books to him by his librarian. But people don't know of her broadly. That will change. And it's on the basis of her nephew's biography of her, a memoir of Jane Austen. Now, some things to know about this. For a long time, this was the go-to about if you wanted to know about the life of Jane Austen, this was it. It was written when her nephew, who's named J. Edward Austen Knight, he's an older man. He's 72 when this comes out, and he knew his Aunt Jane up until the time he was 20. She passed away when he was 20 years old. So the impetus for writing this book was that he was the child of the last surviving sibling of Jane Austen. And they were afraid that the people who actually knew her, that lived in the same time period, were not long for the earth, and that perhaps they ought to record what was known of her. But he, as a younger person, he's a Victorian. He is not a Georgian. So a lot of the detail in this is what nowadays we would call revisionist, certainly scrubbed up. It's the version of events that the family would like people to know. So 160 letters are what I said that was only remaining, and those over the years have been bought and sold. They are commodities. They are incredibly valuable simply because their scarcity adds to their luster. There's just not that many in existence. A few nieces got some letters from Jane as remembrances after her death. Cassandra distributed them, but sometimes they had had pieces cut out of them. Cassandra did it. She took it upon herself to cut pieces of letters she'd prefer people not read out of the document themselves. So this book, though, describes Jane Austen as a hobbyist writer. And nowadays, the scholars would rage against that description based on how they analyzed her writing process and how she was meticulous in revision. She was not a hobbyist per se. Uh, she was highly interested in what she was doing. But it also doesn't tell you what we would call gossip, I suppose, nowadays. Although if it's 200 years old, is it gossip anymore? Her family had an aunt that was a known kleptomaniac. She had actually gone to jail for shoplifting, and yet she was very wealthy. So she'd also had a brother named George, and the family had pretty much written George out of history entirely. He was older than Jane and Cassandra, and he was born with, they think, either cerebral palsy or perhaps epilepsy. But when he was young, he was sent away to live with relatives and never heard from again. Certainly the family wasn't in the business of claiming him. They don't mention him when they say how many brothers and sisters are in their family. And they don't mention of any of her romantic relationships. He calls her Dear Aunt Jane, the hobbyist writer, but not quite. If you were to read what remain of Jane's letters, she herself will tell in her letters about being hungover. So she is not necessarily as sweet, and she's certainly snarky. That's a new word, that modern people would use to describe some of how she uh, portrays people. So it's not quite what he portrayed. But despite its shortcomings, it was sold, and it really fanned the flames of her growing popularity. So a complete set of her letters get published in 1932. On the basis of that book's popularity, he opts to have a better plaque put up at Winchester Cathedral about her, and it finally says Jane Austen, known to many by her writings. Ha ha! It doesn't mention what she wrote. So it's still got a ways to go. Even decades after her death, a verger at Winchester Cathedral was heard to remark whether there was anything particular about that lady so many people want to know where she is buried. So there's a groundswell of people interested in her works, but what to go on? Because as you now know, there isn't a whole lot. The only image they had was the one that Cassandra did, and it wasn't even finished. So, as part of the memoir publication, J. Edward Austen Knight requests a watercolor be made by a contemporary Victorian artist in 1870. And then from that, they do an engraving. That is the picture that most people know when they think of Jane Austen. So, as I say, there just wasn't much to go on. But there's a niece that owns the original, and she's alive at the time the engraving is done. And her comment was, I think the portrait is very much superior to anything that could have been expected from the image it was taken from. It is a very pleasing, sweet face, though I confess to not thinking it much like the original, but that the public will not be able to detect. So, in other words, she doesn't even think it looks like her. So they've kind of scrubbed this too. Originally, she sat in a Georgian chair, and here it's gone Victorian. If you know your antique furniture, you might see all that. Those kind of curved, softened edges are very Victorian, and they assume then that's what happened to her face too. But it's in keeping with the image the family wanted to create for her. So, what to do though if there isn't much to go on? The UK government took it and ran with it. Back in September of 2017, they came out with the £10 note that features her face. It originally would have had Queen Elizabeth II on it, but then upon her death, Charles is replaced on banknotes. So nowadays, this is absolutely still legal currency. It's made of a polymer, it's plastic, which, if you see it as an American, sometimes we think it's funny money. But I happen to have one. I say this is probably what the cheapest known price of a souvenir of Jane Austen that you can get. So just to give you a bit of a look, what I think is the most striking feature of it is this window. So here's the pencil, and you can see, there it is. It's clear. That's a clear plastic window in their £10 note, and it's got all sorts of interesting things going on in it. If I kind of raise it to the light, this is the quill for her being a writer that's out of copper foil. This says JA in copper foil up here, and then the back, there's the Queen, because I have an older one. There's holograms galore over here. There's one down there. And they also say, I've not tried this myself, but apparently a security feature on the currency is if you were to put this under UV light, it says Bank of England. So we as Americans sometimes don't have the best security features on our currency. That's been known to be true for quite some time. But if you're traveling and you happen to come across a £10 you'd like to hold on to, and you're a Jane fan, why, there's a great opportunity. So let's talk Sanditon. Where did it come from? Because, well, as we left off, there's a remnant of a manuscript hanging out. So it's her last novel, left unfinished, called The Brothers. She gets through 12 chapters. That's it. It's 24,000 words when she finishes or when she stops. And based on how much she usually wrote, that would have been about a fifth of a finished book before she got ill and ultimately passed away when she was 41. So it came out in an unfinished form in 1925. It was put together by a man at Oxford, and it was called at the time Fragments of a Novel. And also, curiously, there is a little paper label on the side already that says Sanditon. So her family called it that. The manuscript that this was drawn from was still owned by the Austen family at this point. So, speaking of manuscripts, though, there are two known copies of the fragment of a novel that would be Sanditon. One lives at King's College Library in Cambridge, a part of the university library system, and as a rare book dealer would tell you, they have committed a party foul, a sin. They have stamped her handwritten manuscript. They have put a permanent mark on it, King's College Library. And people nowadays would scream, no, no, these are so rare and so valuable. You do not mark up originals like this. Well, it was done back in the 30s. So this original manuscript, that is in Jane Austen's handwriting. It's been digitally put into their library system. You can see it. And they also transcribed it into print, and they even added her edits. So it's really valuable if you want to see how she writes. So in 1930, King's College Library in Cambridge was presented this manuscript by Jane's great niece, and it was done in honor of her sister and her brother-in-law. The brother-in-law had been the provost of King's College, and she sent in a little note with her donation of this family manuscript that said she was happy to have saved it from the Americans. Really, because at the time there had been numerous record-setting auctions of pieces of her manuscripts that her family were separating and selling. Some had gone to America. One in particular went to a library in New York. More on that in a moment. But there is one other version of this fragment of a novel, handwritten, and it was written out by Cassandra, a copy she did. And that one lives at the Jane Austen House Museum. So, just in the category of, well, how valuable are these things? This is an example of a remnant. In 2011, Sotheby's auction house did the sale of an unfinished handwritten Jane manuscript called The Watsons. And this is just a portion of it. It was divided up. That book was started in 1803 while Jane was living in Bath, but after her father died in 1805, she abandoned it. So another portion of this manuscript went to the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City, and they've just had a big exhibition about her this past year as well. So Jane's relatives are selling off the stuff. It is valuable. This portion that it ultimately went to Oxford, $1.3 million paid for it at the Bodleian Library. This one is interesting. It even has Jane's original revisions that she is pinned in place with a straight pin on another piece of paper. And that was because the water, or the content of the paper at the time was high in rags, and it was almost like working with cloth. She could do that. So another inkling of how valuable is Jane memorabilia nowadays, authentic things. This is Jane Austen's ring. If you watched a PBS miniseries called Miss Austen, it was about Cassandra, really. It aired this past year. The actress that in flashback plays Jane Austen while she was alive is wearing this ring. It's really not terribly valuable as jewelry goes. It's a simple 9 karat gold band, and it's got a cabochon of just turquoise in it. But to let you know, you can see a replica of it at the Jane Austen house, because back in 2012, a member of Jane's surviving family put that ring, the original, up for auction with Sotheby's. It sold for $250,000 to an anonymous buyer. Sotheby's was treating her as anonymous, but she outed herself as Kelly Clarkson, who apparently is a big Janeite. But what they should have told Kelly is that the UK government has a process by which they review items, relics, artifacts, because they have so many, of historical significance. And they have to grant you an export permit on something like that. And the UK government deemed it a national treasure. So it meant that Kelly Clarkson could own the ring, she could just never take it out of the UK. So with that, the Jane Austen House Museum crowdfunded $250,000, and they bought the ring for exactly what from Kelly Clarkson for what she paid for it, and she had a replica made, and that I thought was quite gracious of her. Sanditon, the TV show. We have that man to either blame or thank, depending on your position here. Andrew Davies, a prolific UK screenwriter, mostly working in miniseries for television. He is an older man. He was born in 1936, and of all of the works listed out here, he probably is best known from the mid 90s TV version of Pride and Prejudice starring Colin Firth. That is his show. So, but he's even gotten credits in Bridget Jones films, one and two had his name attached to them. He is asked to write the first three episodes of the first series of Sanditon and the finale of season one, which aired in 2019. So that story, there were three seasons, 2019, then 22 and 23. The story called The Brothers, though, that Jane called it, is really a whole lot different than anything else that Jane published. So the storyline goes that in the early 1800s, there's a couple traveling named Tom and Mary Parker. So Tom is a property developer. He's a promoter, as Jane Austen called it, of a new, what they hope will be an up-and-coming seaside resort called Sanditon. And he and his wife are in this carriage, and they're in an accident. It overturns. He injures his ankle, and he stays with a nearby family named the Haywoods. So he recovers, and as a thank you, really, to that family, he invites their oldest daughter, Charlotte, to carry on with them, to go to the seaside town and live there with them, Charlotte Haywood. Um, then we get kind of a cast of characters that kick off. Tom's brother, Sidney, is also in on trying to develop this seaside town, just as we have property developers today trying to make big money and cash in on enticing people to move there. They also are partners with an older widow who's very wealthy named Lady Denham. She's got an interesting cast that surround her, living at her house. She has a niece and nephew, Esther and Sir Edward. They're step siblings. And then there's a third woman named Clara Brereton, all young people, and they're all kind of in contention for the old lady to die and to see who will inherit afterwards. So the big note, though, in Jane Austen land is that this is the first time Jane has ever introduced a black character. This is a woman named Miss Lamb that's coming, a wealthy heiress from the West Indies, and she's pretty much there. That's it. That's as much as Jane Austen gave. That's where the manuscript ends, and Andrew Davies said he thought he had enough to source material to fill half an episode. And that was true. The first half of the first episode, and that is all. So we had to take clues from history and the manuscript and try to get inspiration elsewhere. ITV canceled this show, but this big upsurge of the Sanditon Sisterhood brought it back. They did all sorts. Hashtag Save Sanditon, 90,000 signatures on a petition, gifts and letters to the producers. They even commissioned sand art on a beach called Burnham-on-Sea. And this is one of the filming beaches. Huge, beautiful, a big stretch of open sand. It's just south of Bristol, which is on the coast in the west. So not quite as far to the east as Jane was living. Bath is inland from there. But this was the hub of the series filming. This and a county just adjacent to the west called Somerset. And they were successful. They brought it back. So Jane's life made its way into Sanditon in a few ways. Her brother Henry Austen went bankrupt. And this is kind of the financial precariousness that Tom Parker was living with too. Henry Austen was originally a banker who owned a bank. He went bankrupt in 1816. He handled payroll for the British Army. And at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the very next year, he was down to a third of the cash flow that he used to have because the army wasn't as active. He made some bad loans. He lost Jane's money. When his bank went down, she had 25 pounds from her riding with him, and that was gone too. So he gave up finance entirely and he joined the clergy. So he has some tendencies to look like Tom Parker too. he was her literary agent for some parts of her life. Now, as she got better known to publishers and had successful books, Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice sold well. That she was able to negotiate her own terms more for herself, but the real rubbing point of her literary career was whatever happened to Susan Northanger Abbey, the first book she sold. She sold it for £10. The publisher who bought it sat on it unpublished for 13 years, and this niggled her no end. So, through her brother, they anonymously arranged 13 years later, when she'd saved up enough money and had Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility under her belt, to anonymously buy that manuscript back. And it wouldn't come out though until after her death, but she did manage to tell her agent to tell the old publisher that, by the way, you've just sold this back to the author of Pride and Prejudice, which was a hit. So kind of a turn of the knife if she got one, but not enough to see it done in her lifetime, published that is. So, did she know she was sick? I would say no. She really didn't expect to die until she wrote her will. Uh, she really made fun. She made fun of characters in the manuscript segment that remains of people who were hypochondriacal. And if you were really badly ill, you might lose your sense of humor about these things. She had witnessed her niece Fanny have to have teeth removed, and Sanditon's manuscript has characters that are talking about witnessing teeth removed. So some people have thought that perhaps Sanditon was a setup. She knew she was dying and she left it for Anna to finish, but perhaps not. I don't know that there's a whole lot of credibility in that. I included a Georgian hand toaster. That would be what she'd be asked to make the toast with. One of the characters she makes fun of as a hypochondriac in Sanditon says that dry toast is like a nutmeg grater in his stomach, and he has to slather his toast with butter to even make it go down in his stomach. Ugh. So, anti-slavery. She's got her first black character. Was Jane anti-slavery? Oh, yes. Her family as well. They admired the writings of a man named Thomas Clarkson, who would go on to start the Abolition Society. So the UK finally they get rid of the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, and then in all their colonies in 1833. So her brother Henry is a delegate to the Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. And then, so far as Jane goes, she mentions it in her works twice. It comes up in Mansfield Park, where the heroine asks her uncle, who's a known slave trader, a question about slavery for which she just hears silence. Nothing is said in reply. And then in Emma, a governess complains that she feels enslaved, and the book says that they are both victims. So Miss Lamb is a West Indian heiress. She's 17 and she's going to have she said she was always to have the best room in her lodgings. So it would have been interesting to see what had done with her. A major theme of Sanditon, and why is it attractive, and so says the book in talking about the fictional place, is the seaside and sea bathing. A seaside resort in Georgian times would have always offered sea bathing. So there are these little they're basically sheds. They're on wheels, bathing machines, and they are towed out by a couple of handles into the tide. And the men and women these are done on separate beaches, so they don't commingle. And you're wearing basically flowing linens that resemble pajamas, and you're dunked in the sea in the shed to preserve your privacy. So people thought, though, that this is a great cure to go to the sea air and the water were wonderful. And Jane and her family subscribed to this too. In Sanditon, she writes, sea air was healing, softening, relaxing, fortifying, embracing. If the sea breeze failed, the sea bath was the certain corrective. And they took that on board because for their fictional portrayal of Sanditon, they made this mock-up poster that said, experience this fine seaside resort and partake in sea bathing. Machines available. So that was hopefully what would draw people there. Well, where is Sanditon based? Is there a town it's inspired by? The leading candidate seems to be here, Worthing, on the south coast. So there is Worthing now. It's known by letters that exist that she and her mother and sister and a few nieces came and stayed here after the death of her father in 1905. They stayed in a cottage that was newish at the time and now is the home of Pizza Express, which is a chain of pizza restaurants. So they kept the building. And if you screw in your monocle again and put in your magnifying glass, you can see this little blue dot. That's the blue badge. Jane Austen stayed here in 1805. So what's it got going for it? Well, it's up and coming when she was there. They had sea views of the English Channel. They would have been exciting to her. There's a circulating library there, and Sanditon had one in the book too. That's a subscription library where you pay a fee, and it's nice because books are expensive then, and they use the fees to buy new books that really appeal to a lot of readers. So maybe you can find something for everyone there. They also sell trinkets. It's almost like a souvenir shop too. So it was a social hub, just like Sanditon aspires to be. She describes a man there in Worthing called Sweet Mr. Ogle, the town's property promoter. Ha ha, that's very much like Tom Parker. So if you want to visit Pizza Express and do the Jane tour, you'd have to go to Worthing to pick that up. So the last thing I mentioned, and I feel like it's the elephant in the room, is that if you have watched the series, you will know that there are some very racy plot lines going on between the two step siblings and Clara Brereton, the three young people that live with Lady Denham waiting for her demise, basically, to see who inherits. So the question is there anything in the manuscript that would have hinted that Jane's mind was going at all in that direction? And the answer is yes. So, uh, regarding her character, Sir Edward, this is how he's described at Looking at Women. Miss Heywood, or any other young woman with any pretensions to beauty, he was entitled, according to his own view of society, to approach, with high compliment and rhapsody on the slightest acquaintance. But it was Clara alone on whom he had serious designs. It was Clara whom he meant to seduce. Now, Jane's words. So that's something there. But arguably, the plot line of the TV show is nothing that Jane Austen ever would have written or conceived of. So I won't go into huge detail there in case you haven't seen it. But for that, some Janeites are rather strident that this deviates too much. So we got asked Andrew Davies, why'd you do this? And he was interviewed about that. His quote, "I really aim to please myself writing these things. I write something that I would like to watch. And I suppose the sexing it up thing comes in fairly naturally. If it's not there, I feel that's a shame, and I put some in." So there you have it. It is down to him. But Georgian society overall, as you've heard, had a much higher tolerance for bawdiness than the more proper Victorians to come, though Jane Austen never would have gone as far as Andrew Davies did in her books. Well, I have to conclude somewhere, and I suppose now is a good time. I will remind you, if you're looking for a last minute holiday gift, within your library system, I know you have High Tea and the Low Down. It is not a cookbook. Some people have asked. It's anecdotes, it's essays on what it's like to live in the UK as an American. So if you decide to move over and be Jane for a while, I'd suggest maybe that's a good starting point for your research. You can get it wherever by name. Just order it wherever you like to get books, and I'll come back to you. And here I am. If you'd like to drop any questions you might have in the chat, I see one now. And do you mind if, Jill, if I read it out then?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. It says it's from Pat. I love your slide of the George. I think it's the Georges. Yes, the difference between Regency and Georgian. That, along with your comment about Queen Victoria succeeding after the Georgian era, finally enabled me to get the chronology of the 17 and 18 straight in my head. I say, Pat, ain't that the truth? Because I am a longtime viewer of Antiques Roadshow. And some of these commentators would say, "Oh, this is Georgian. Oh, this is Regency." And I never really knew exactly what they're referring to. So very selfishly, I looked this up because I wanted to know. I knew in theory what it should be, especially because we happen by quite a good deal to own a piece of Georgian furniture. And I thought, ooh, is it all the way back to 17 something where it began? Is it 1717, something like that? Probably not. It's more like 18, what? It would have been the end when Victoria came in the 1830s. Oh, that's quite a bit of time difference. So for that, I felt like I had to look it up and not and just be disappointed, you know. So let's see. Oh, thank you. People who love the talks. I aim to please. Um, is it known why, as Christine asks, is it known why her brother begrudgingly let Jane and her sister use his house? He was not alone in this. They were kind of shuttled amongst the male relatives. So he basically had to take his turn. They're burdens. They are unmarried women with no income, and they are a drain on your resources. So begrudging meaning, yes, he had it to spare. Some of his brothers that took them for a while, or at least paid for them to be put up somewhere, weren't as wealthy as he was, but they were just kind of just as the books describe, in peril now that they have no male that can earn money, and they're in no position to earn. Jane's earnings from writing were not enough to sustain either herself or any of her family. So they were not well pleased that they hadn't gotten married. So that is part of it too. Let's see. Oh, thank you. It was commentary on my animation. And I especially appreciate this because this point of the year, I've done this talk a lot. We'll leave it there. So it's very popular nowadays. Uh, Thomas asks, how about a recent BBC, I think, miniseries conjecturing? Oh, it says Charlotte's destruction. It's Cassandra. He's referring, yes, that's Miss Austen. That is the miniseries that aired earlier this year, and done in flashbacks. But the plot line is that a man who would have had a hoard of letters from now deceased Jane is about ready to pass away, and Jane's older sister Cassandra is still very much alive and doesn't want them to fall into the hands of people she's basically afraid will publicize them. And it's about her surreptitiously searching the house. She takes it upon herself to pay a visit and descends upon this house. And factual, no. Thank you, Andrew Davies. He didn't do it. I don't think he wrote that show, but that is. I've never read anything that made that plot line a parallel, other than the fact that Cassandra indeed is the one who burned them. But no, as to how she got them, she was handed them. She was. It was not nearly as dramatic as that show would have you think. Let's see. Ellen says, I'm sure that women during that time would have preferred to earn their own money. Laugh out loud. Absolutely. I'm reading a really good book, and I'm through it mostly, and it just came out in 2025. It's called Jane Austen's Bookshelf. Have you heard of it at the library?
Yep.
Ah, okay. Have you read it?
Nope.
Okay. It's pretty
Not
good.
yet. Yeah.
It's so the author's named Rebecca Romney. If you're into more obscure detail, but not in a uninteresting way, Rebecca Romney is a fairly well-known rare book dealer. She's been on as an expert on pawn shop shows. Not that I watch those per se, but rare book dealers are interesting. There's I think a documentary that she's in on Prime Video about the antiquarian bookshops and what it's like to be a rare book dealer. And she does research on what was Jane Austen reading and what informed her. And it's all these women writers that really history is kind of muted. And some of them, in her opinion, because she goes back and she reads these books, are really good. And they even get mentions in some of Jane's books. And Jane's characters go so far as to say that they don't trust anyone who hasn't read this. Some of the books that Rebecca Romney mentions. So if you're into, and one of them makes her own living. Rare. I'm trying to remember her name. Charlotte Lennox, I believe, is a writer that Jane admired that actually made a living as a writer. And it was out of pure need. She had no plan B. She was poor and all her family was dead, and she was a child prodigy in language arts, and she did it. So she would be interesting if that's your way of thinking. I would think Charlotte Lennox might be interesting to read because she actually made a living from doing it. Uh, yes,
So
Tom.
the question was the who's the author? So that was Rebecca
Rebecca
Romney.
Bromney.
Yep, and the
Rebecca
book is either
Bromney.
we have it or it's on order, and I just placed an order for a large print version as well. So
Oh,
that'll
good.
be coming to the library.
I
So,
appreciate large
yep.
print versions as a
Mhm.
consumer.
Yeah.
Oh, Thomas said, Cassandra, sorry, I got my Brontes mixed up. That's true too. I do it and other people do it. It happens all the time.
Yep.
So let's see. Anybody else?
Oh, and this Thomas had a second comment that
Oh, so
just
sorry.
came
Well,
in.
speaking of wild Austen fiction, what do you think of Becoming Jane's films, biographical liberties? Well, after I've done the research for this talk, pretty much any film ever made about Jane Austen is going to have to take liberties because there's just so little to go on compared to people of her magnitude. You've got a complete packet of correspondence. Now, if you had 3,000 letters,
Mm,
oh, I think you wouldn't really have to stray far, and you could probably be justified in saying that's not true because you have this big encyclopedia. But when there's just this thin record, what do you do? So I don't know that I could ever take somebody to task for, being. Sanditon goes a bit wild, though. That's why I feel like I really need to mention that. Have you seen that or no? I don't get into the extreme detail because I figure some people watching these talks have not seen it, so I don't want to give it away. But
I
that
think that's what gets the a lot of the viewers though, so something that they're like, oh, that's what people want to
Well,
see.
that's what Andrew Davies said exactly that.
Yeah.
That if it's not there, I wish it was, and I put some in,
Yeah.
paraphrasing.
Right.
So you can't please everybody all the time, I suppose, is the upshot of that line of commentary. So, okay. So, all right.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you. It looks like we got all the questions, I think, and then there's some people saying thank you and they enjoyed the talk very much. So that's awesome. Thank you. And we're going to have Claire back for another program, not about Jane, but some other British spies
Yes,
actually
this
in
is part
January.
two.
So we'll get that on the calendar for everybody if you want to keep your eye out for that.
Summer vacation part two. What other talk did you do on your holiday? That British spycraft and espionage novels. So to be continued.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful, Claire, and
Oh, you're
we'll
welcome.
see you in January for a different program.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye.